Hi guys, welcome to the second half of the History of Philosophy module, where we'll be covering classical Chinese philosophy. Before we get started, let me just say a few things about how this half of the module is going to run. So, first of all, you've got two books that you need to buy. If you haven't bought these yet, they are available at No Alibis on Botanic Avenue. So you've got Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, that's one book, and the other one is Readings in Classical Chinese Philosophy. So the Readings book, as you might guess, has translations of primary texts, actual classical Chinese philosophy. And the intro book is more of a textbook. So commentary on these people, some historical context, explanation of the main arguments, how these things have developed later on, theoretical tools for helping you understand these kinds of things. I also want to say right at the beginning, I am not an expert. This is not my area of specialization. What that means is you should not be expecting these lecture videos to give you, here's the definitive word on the right way to interpret the philosophers we're going to read. You are going to have to rely on your reading primarily. That's kind of true in all of your philosophy modules. You're going to have to rely on your reading and your conversation with other students in classes. We're going to have those conversations. I will be participating in those conversations in our online classes and on the discussion boards. But the kind of thing that I'm going to aim to give you in these lecture videos is sort of brief nutshell summaries of what to look for, things to keep in mind as you're reading. I think in general, a good strategy is for each of these. So for each week, you will have some chapters from the intro textbook and some chapters from the readings assigned. I think in general, it's a good idea to take a look at the intro chapters first before doing the readings. Partly that's because there's some variation among the different primary texts that we have. Some of them are very straightforwardly argumentative and look a whole lot like, a philosophical treatise you might find in, say, the early modern period of Western philosophy, like you've seen in the first half of this module. But some of them are strangers, so that applies this week, as we'll get into. And in those cases, it's I think very helpful to have a sort of framework of like a story about what kind of philosophy you're encountering before going and trying to read the philosopher in question. So with all of that said, let's start this week's unit, our first unit on classical Chinese philosophy. This week we're going to be talking about Confucius, probably the most famous classical Chinese philosopher. If you've heard of any Chinese philosophers, I'm sure you've heard of Confucius. Before we talk about him in particular, let me just say a little bit about historical context here. So when we talk about classical Chinese philosophy, when are we thinking of? We are thinking of philosophy during what's called the Eastern Zhou dynasty. So this is 722 to 221 BCE. You will sometimes see people, if they're going to tell you what era the philosopher they're talking about is, talk about one of these smaller periods within the Eastern Zhou dynasty, so the earlier period of the Spring and Autumn. The Spring and Autumn period named after the Spring and Autumn Annals, work recording historical events in this time. So that's in the first part of the Eastern Zhou dynasty and later on the Warring States period. I don't want to emphasize dates too much here. I'm not going to ask you to memorize philosophers' dates. If you find it interesting or helpful to think about how these dates compare with other philosophers from, say, Western history, that's nice. You can go right ahead with that. It's good to know more things, but I'm not going to emphasize these things. It is a good idea to keep in mind which of the philosophers we read who are responding to each other, who's after whom. We're largely going to be looking at people in chronological order, so the people that we cover earlier are earlier than people we cover later in later weeks. That's not a hard and fast rule, but it works as a rule of thumb. I do want to say a little bit about the historical context here, aside from just what the dates are. So something that characterizes this period more and more as time goes on, is that these are periods of conflict in China between many small states. So China is relatively disunited during this period, particularly in the Warring States period. Why that matters is, I think this is standardly thought to partly explain why this is a period of flourishing of philosophical schools. So when you have lots of these small states ruled by dukes and kings, pretender kings, who want to rule more than they already do and are regularly in conflict, this is good for business if you're a philosopher. So not only are these people out there, trying to buy more chariots and arrows and so on, but they're also looking for, is there a philosopher out there who can tell me the secrets of running my state well, or of conducting warfare well, so that I'll be successful and might be able to, make my small state larger. That shapes the kind of philosophy that we're going to get. So a lot of the philosophers, maybe almost all of the philosophers we're going to look at, will be addressing questions like, how should you run a state well? Questions about political philosophy, about social organization, about ethics. But I don't want to overstate that too much. We will also see philosophers addressing questions in other areas of philosophy. So the Mohists, rivals to the Confucians, whom we're going to look at next week, we'll see they spend a bunch of their time, as they're trying to argue that they're right and the Confucians are wrong, will tell you not only here's an argument for my view and against Confucius's view, but also here's how you should evaluate arguments. Here are rules you can use for forming correct opinions, for deciding who's right when there's a dispute. So these are questions in epistemology and logic. So all of this stuff gets touched on, but it does seem like when there are many interested buyers, there's a lot of demand for the kind of philosophy that answers questions about how to run your state well. Philosophers tailor the supply to that. There are a lot of them providing answers to those kinds of questions. Okay, that's what's in the air. Let's talk about Confucius. So Confucius, that name Confucius, is a romanization of the name Kongzi, or Confuzi. So that name sort of literally means something like Master Kong. This ZI particle at the end of the name here, you're going to see that at the end of the name of almost all of the philosophers that we read, maybe all of them. That's, by the way, pronounced Z, not Z. If you want a rough and ready guide to pronouncing Chinese words transcribed using the pinyin system that has been standard in mainland China since the early 90s, I've got a video on that. You'll find it on this page. So, right, Kongzi means Master Kong. Next week, the Mohists, their guy, the head of that school, is Master Mozi. Okay, so Kongzi, I'm just going to keep calling him Kongzi because that's what your textbook does. So Kongzi lived his traditional dates are 551 to 479 BCE, which puts him in that earlier period, the spring and autumn period of the Eastern Zhou. I'm not going to say too much about his sort of biography, his life history, because we have a more polished video written by Brian Van Norden, who wrote your intro textbook and co-edited your readings book. That'll give you a brief overview of the life and significance of Confucius. I will say this, though, much like a philosopher like Socrates, we don't have any surviving writings of Kongzi. What we have instead are the Analects. So the Analects, which is the first primary text in your readings book, is a compilation of short stories about Kongzi and sayings attributed to him, compiled by his students. So some of these are very, very short, like just a couple of sentences. And some of them are, a few paragraphs. But yeah, they tell stories about things that he said, things that he did. And this is what we have about the person himself. Now, that can make it challenging, particularly for people like you and me who are not already experts in the school of philosophy that we now call Confucianism. Which, by the way, I should say the Chinese word for what the Chinese word that we translate as Confucianism doesn't have his name in it. So it's something like Ruism, where Ru means something like learned person, refined person, something like that. Has no connection to the name Confucius, although he is thought of. It's not just we in the West who think Confucius is important. He is regarded as, the sort of head guy in the Ruist philosophy. I'm going to carry on calling it Confucianism because that's what we do in English. But right, okay, if you're not already sort of steeped in Confucian philosophy, you might sort of look at these stories and think, well, that's nice. It can be a little bit tough to get to grips with what kind of philosophy Confucius was teaching. We know that he was teaching, like he had students, he tried to, and I suppose sometimes successfully did, sell his services to various kings and dukes to try and help them, run their states according to his teachings. But I think you're going to have the best results dealing with the primary text if you first read the chapter, at least chapter 2 in the intro text. That's why that's assigned. Chapter 3 is also a good idea. So what I'm going to do in the rest of this video is talk to you very briefly about something that's in that chapter 2 of the intro textbook. So in that chapter, Van Norden gives you 5 themes that you'll find in the Analects. So I want to talk more briefly than he does here about those themes and how they fit together to give you sort of a guideline for reading through the Analects. The exercise I'd like you to do for this week's tutorial, whether you're participating in the online synchronous sessions on Friday or posting on the discussion forums, I want you to look for passages in the Analects that illustrate one or more of these themes. So I want you to find one of those short little stories, give us the reference, say which theme you think is illustrated here, and tell us something about why. Why do you think that theme is showing up here? What do you think Confucius is saying on that theme? Something like that. Okay, so some themes. I'm not going to talk about all of the themes that Van Norden brings up, but here are some that jump out to me as important. So first one that I'll mention is his Van Norden's third in his numbering, the family and differentiated caring. So there are 2 separate things here, the family on the one hand and differentiated caring on the other. So first of all, you'll notice as you're reading the Analects that Confucius has a lot to say about families. He has a lot to say about fathers and sons, about brothers. There is some very patriarchal. There are some very patriarchal presumptions that go into a lot of this stuff. Ancient China, like so many other societies, was a very patriarchal kind of place. One of your optional readings for this week looks at whether we can see analogies between some stuff in feminist philosophy and some things that Confucius has to say, but we can talk more about that later. It may be that we can keep the good things in Confucianism while stripping away some of the patriarchal stuff. But anyway, I'm going to just carry on talking about fathers, sons, brothers, because that is how Confucius talks. The original stuff is already gendered. So, okay, one way that talk about the family shows up is as a metaphor or analogy for the state. So you might see an analogy between the relationship between fathers and sons, rulers and subjects. If you have heard a little bit about Confucian philosophy or maybe Chinese thinking generally or something like that, you may have heard of this idea of filial piety. So filial is a fancy word for uh, father-son like. There's an idea of so there's supposed to be things going in both directions here. So fathers have obligations to their sons, and sons have obligations to their fathers. The one owes the other protection and care, and in the other direction you have respect and deference, that kind of thing. That is a theme. How is that important for us philosophically? Let's move this into the other half of this theme, differentiated caring. This is going to become important, particularly next week when we see the Mohists disagree with the Confucians. So here's a way of putting the thought. According to Confucius, we do and we should care more for some people than for others. That's not obvious. So if you've done some ethical philosophy elsewhere, maybe you've run into, say, utilitarians who think that morality, ethics requires us to do whatever increases pleasure and reduces suffering for the most people. It doesn't matter who those people are. You should care about all of them equally. My suffering matters as much as yours, no more, no less. Your suffering matters no more or no less than my father's or my mother's. Likewise, it's not just utilitarians. Maybe you've run into Kantians who will say, you should never treat a person as a mere means. You should always treat people as ends in themselves. Again, it doesn't matter who those people are. You owe everybody sort of the same kinds of things. Maybe here's a way of putting it. The closer your social ties to a person, the more you should care about them. So this fits with that idea of sort of filial piety that I was just talking about, right? A Confucian thought is that you have special responsibilities to the people who are in your family. You also have special responsibilities to people who are your friends as opposed to people who aren't. You have special responsibilities to your ruler or to your subjects if you happen to be a ruler, lucky you, that are different for, how much you ought to care about people who aren't. Okay. If you were a utilitarian, you might be okay with saying that as a matter of sort of human psychology, we do tend to care more about our family than for people who aren't our family, but you might want to say that's a moral failing, right? The person in the street, their suffering should matter to me every bit as much as my brother's suffering. But as a matter of fact, that's not how I work. So Confucius is going to say, no, this is correct. This is how things ought to be. You ought to care more for people with whom you have a special relationship than others. So right, next week we will see the Mohists disagree with this. I'll leave that there. So another theme is ritual propriety. You'll see a lot of talk in the Analects about the rites and ritual propriety. And at least at first, this might sound exotic or outdated or superstitious or something like that. Confucius really cares about the rituals and rites being done correctly and with the right attitude and all of that sort of stuff. So a first point I want to make is, so as I said, this might seem exotic or outdated, but Confucius has a very broad conception of what counts as a rite or a ritual. And we have things like this now as well. Those of you who are doing philosophy and anthropology might be familiar with this kind of stuff. But so some examples of rituals that we have now vary. So just as in Confucius's conception of rituals, there's a whole spectrum of these things from the very grand ones. So in our case, we have rituals like crowning a monarch or beginning a session of parliament or state funerals where you have, a flag over a coffin and important people doing important things. So that's one end of the spectrum from the grand to at the other end of the spectrum, we have very mundane things like shaking hands or queuing. Something I want you to get about these things is not only that we do them, that these are things that you could describe as rituals, but that there are rules governing them, right? You don't shake hands with your left hand unless for say disability reasons, there should be an exception. But unless there's a reason not to, you shake with your right hand. Why? Because that's how we do it. Queuing, you might think, is a totally natural thing that is just universal and not a ritual. But if you go to China, for instance, my experience is there is no ritual around queuing for just about anything there. Unless there are fences directing you to queue, people don't spontaneously queue for like buses. You get on as quickly as you can. I kind of like that. Anyway, so Van Norden says, here's a useful way of thinking about these things that we can take from anthropology. There's something called functionalism about rituals. Not the same as the functionalism that you might have run into in other parts of analytic philosophy, but this kind of functionalism, this as a perspective on rituals, asks us, when we're looking at a given ritual, what social goal is achieved by this ritual? What social goal is achieved by the rules governing that ritual? So you might think, say, a coronation. What's the point of that? Well, the sort of answer that we're looking for as functionalists isn't, something like, this is when the monarch gains, is anointed by God or something like that. That's a story told within the ritual. But maybe a social goal of having a big elaborate coronation is something like giving the populace a feeling of the legitimate transfer of power, maybe explicit connection to a historical tradition. I don't know. I grew up in another country. I'm not really sure what coronations are supposed to be like. But like the opening of Parliament, there are bits where I think there's a bit where like somebody from the House of Lords goes and knocks on the door to the House of Commons and they don't answer, and this is supposed to make an important point about how they're autonomous from each other. There are things that the symbols are supposed to achieve. With the more mundane rituals, we can still ask, well, what's the point of queuing? Well, first of all, that serves to, distribute, what do you call them, scarce goods in a relatively equitable way. We keep track of who arrived first so that, we don't just all wind up elbowing and shoving each other out of the way. Turns out you can get along without that in places like China. But that's what that thing achieves for us. What's the point of shaking hands? Well, maybe that has to do with, some gesture of intimacy, like at a remove, etc. Okay. And there are other things that are sort of in between that aren't. So coronations and state funerals are sort of the exclusive preserve of the ruling class. But even the rest of us have less mundane kinds of rituals, like weddings. I will have more to say about weddings later on, but you might think about lots of the customs that go into weddings, although, we have a lot more different kinds of wedding rituals nowadays than maybe we used to, as people sort of question why we have the rituals we do and whether they're worth preserving. But there are lots of there are lots of rules governing how weddings work, and funerals and proposals and things that happen with some amount of ceremony like this. Okay. So Confucius is really big on the rites and rituals and doing them properly as a way of making sure that your society runs right. This is another thing that next week we'll see the Mohists disagree about. They will especially say putting a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time even into expensive or lavish rituals is a bad idea. So Confucius thinks taking the rites very seriously, including elaborate state rites, big musical productions, that's a thing, ritual music, is important because of the feelings that it engenders in us. And the Mohists will say this is just a big waste of money. We'll get into what they say next week, but okay. properly conducted rituals, very important for Kongzi. This is a controversial question in classical China. Why do we care about the rituals? I kind of answered this question already, but here is another theme, one of Van Noorden's 5 themes. Here's another theme that the rituals play into: ethical cultivation. So one reason rituals are important, they help cultivate good ethical character. Confucius spends a lot of time talking about how to cultivate good ethical character in a ruler, in a populace, in individual people. And sort of the same answer for all of these kinds of things. He does have a picture where the sort of elite, the gentlemen, the preservers of tradition need to have good virtuous character. If they are raised up in a state, then that will lead to the rest of the population showing good ethical character, and then your state will be smashing. So, okay, a lot of what Kongzi talks about in the Analects and a lot of what later Confucian philosophers are going to write about has to do with cultivating virtuous character. So, some things to say about virtues. Again, those of you who are taking the moral theories module may have run into virtue ethics already. The chapter 3 of the intro textbook you've got for this class describes a way of interpreting Confucius as a virtue ethicist. But notice that you don't have to be a virtue ethicist to have a story about virtues. So if a virtue ethicist is someone who says, the right moral questions to ask and the right way to answer moral questions about, say, what is the right way to behave, what is the morally right way to behave, the right way to frame those questions and to answer them is in terms of virtues, and say, here are the traits of character that one ought to have, and one ought to act in a way that proceeds from those virtues. That's a virtue ethicist. You might be, say, a Kantian or a utilitarian and still think there's such a thing as virtues. So you might think the right answer to questions about how we ought to act are minimize suffering and maximize pleasure for the most people possible. But you might still say, here's what makes for a virtuous person, right? You're probably going to tell a story where the kinds of character traits you want to have are the ones that lead to a minimum of suffering and a maximum of pleasure for the maximum of people. But you can still have a story about virtues. So, as Van Noorden will say, you don't have to interpret Confucius as a virtue ethicist, but you can. He'll describe a way that you can interpret him as a virtue ethicist. So that leads naturally into, this is my last slide. I will just tell you what some of the cardinal virtues for Confucius are, and I'll refer you to the textbook to see more about them. What counts as a virtuous character? Probably the two biggest ones are, so this word run, which gets translated variously as goodness or humaneness or benevolence. I put the character here because, as Van Noorden will tell you in the textbook, it's maybe kind of telling. So there are 4 strokes here you can see. The 2 on the left of the character mean person, and the 2 on the right mean 2, like as in the number 2. So a way of reading what's going on here is this is a virtue that has to do with relations between people and each other. When you've got personness and 2 of them, that's where humaneness or benevolence comes in. This is a very broad virtue. You will see lots of things where there are passages in the Analects where, for example, people ask Confucius directly, hey, what is this? What is run? One of his answers is love others. Maybe the next biggest one, or another big one, is wisdom. In that same passage, the character asks Confucius, this is 12:22, asks him, what is wisdom? And he says, know people. Right? What is humaneness? Love people. What is wisdom? Know people. Okay. Something that we will talk about in the next video, in comparison with the Mohists. Wisdom seems to involve, at least in Van Norden's interpretation in that next chapter we're going to talk about, seems to involve knowing how to apply ethical thinking to the specifics of a situation. So where the Mohists, much like utilitarians, are going to say there's like one ethical rule that you can apply to absolutely everything, just apply it everywhere. Confucius is going to say everything's complicated, and one of the things that those gentlemen, the educated elite, we need to raise up and in a state in order to help it run well. One of the critical things that they need to exercise is wisdom in how to make decisions, choose how to act, choose how to deal with people in their particular circumstances. So there's going to be lots of variation. Other virtues that Confucius talks about that you'll see a little bit about in the Van Norden chapter, righteousness, which probably has something to do, as I understand it, with acting correctly in your social role. This is connected with the rituals. Dutifulness, similarly, trustworthiness, being sort of true to your word and that kind of thing, and courage. I'm going to leave it there. Ask me questions. Go read the thing. You're really going to need to rely on the textbook. That's how it is. We are all going to be learning from the text together. So, I'll stop there. Talk to you soon.